I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome, everybody. Today, we're covering, as usual, a host of diverse topics. We're starting with CRT. Ben's going to kick us off on some anti-CRT propaganda. I'll be talking about the first transgender athlete to be competing in the upcoming Tokyo Olympics. Emily's going to cover the opportunity cost or the growing opportunity cost of motherhood. And then Josh is going to close us out with a robust and stimulating discussion of recent events from the Supreme Court. So with that, we'll kick it over to Ben to start.
We'll start the week off with some good news, which is that the anti-CRT forces in this country appear to be winning. And we know that because everyone and their mother, from the Don Lemons and Joy Reids of the world to Chuck Todd and Brian Stelter and beyond, are freaking out about what they claim is an anti-CRT freak out. And so you've seen segment after segment featuring those talking on these networks about the pouncing and seizing of conservatives on CRT. And the narrative has sort of proceeded like this. And I think this is actually the template for how these narratives typically proceed. First, it's, well, there's no invasion of our schools of CRT in the first place. And then it's, okay, well, CRT is going into schools, but it's not what evil conservatives say it is. And then it's, well, it is what evil conservatives say it is, but you're a racist and a bigot if you dare oppose it. And that's pretty much where we're at today. And as a consequence of many viral videos of parents speaking up to their elected officials and school officers and others, legislation that's going through and executive actions being taken in states across the country, and also federal lawmakers speaking out on this issue and putting forth policy as well to combat CRT. Consequently, the left feels, I believe, that they are losing as a consequence of this freakout. And if you look at the rhetoric, many on the left are trying to paint the opposition, the backlash against CRT, to insurrectionist measures, opposition to election integrity, strengthening measures at the state level. So you can see they're trying to essentially make, once again, anti-CRT efforts racist, cast those who oppose CRT as racist. And that usually means that you've won the argument, or at least the other side doesn't want to debate on the merits. So I think this is something that ought to harden us. This is an issue that is sort of broken through beyond partisan sort of divides to basic cultural fabric of the country. Do we want our kids being indoctrinated in what I would term racial Marxism in our schools, pitting people against each other on the basis of race, and ultimately fomenting mass divisions within this country, which of course accrue to those doing the dividing? So I think these are all positive things. And so what I would put out to the group today is, first of all, what are the lessons that we ought to take thus far? It's not as if we can declare victory, because of course, the long march never stops. Plenty of states and localities are still seeking to implement these kinds of curriculums. The 1619 project has not been purged from school curricula across the country. And even this push for civics in schools appears to be a Trojan horse to try to impose further leftism in an already left-dominant institution, which is our public academic institutions. But all that said, what are the lessons to be learned so far? And then what are the political implications of what we're seeing right now?
Well, I'm happy to kick us off here. I mean, it seems to me that this is just one shining example of a current, or, it's kind of a leitmotif. It's a running theme on this podcast. We kind of always say, there's a lot of bad happening in the country right now, but if we pause, if we kind of regain our sobriety or composure, we can prudently assess what the left is doing on XYZ issues, and we can reasonably predict that they are overstepping. I feel like we've said this on basically every podcast since we launched this back in January. And whether it's CRT, whether it's transgender athletes, which we're obviously going to talk about in a later segment on the show, there's just any number of issues now where it seems like, despite declining church and synagogue attendances, despite kind of declining religiosity in general, we kind of feel on this podcast that there is a kind of a median reasonableness, that there still remains kind of a reasonable sentiment of Americanism, a reasonable kind of, even a vestigial kind of sentiment of pro-American pride, frankly, in the American citizenry that will look at this absolute bat crap craziness and say that I oppose it. So I mean, that is, I think, what is very slowly happening here. There's a lot of people to thank for this, obviously. Chris Rufo has obviously been indispensable. We've given Barry Weiss on this podcast a number of shout outs for her kind of CRT investigative journalism work as well. The fight is obviously not over, but look, we're recording this on Tuesday. In Newsweek just this morning, I published Charles Lehman of the Manhattan Institute and City Journal on this issue, and part of this is kind of like it's a very classic kind of leftist bait and switch to an extent, right? I mean, they're kind of quibbling about what is critical race theory. I mean, I saw a clip of Joy Reid on MSNBC the other day, or more accurately, someone unfortunately retweeted this into my Twitter feed. I'm not going to actually watch MSNBC. And it's Joy Reid basically saying, like, who opposes critical race theory? You're just talking about kind of Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and like the great march of kind of race relations in America. No, that's obviously not what conservatives are objecting to here. We're objecting to denigrating, dehumanizing garbage that says because you are born with a certain specific skin pigmentation, you are ipso facto of the oppressor class. As Yoram Hazony, of Edmund Burke Foundation, wrote in his Quillette essay last August, this is just Marxism under another name. They basically replace kind of the oppressor-oppressed class struggle with the oppressor-oppressed racial struggle. And it's encouraging to see this kind of grassroots uprising happen. And all we can just do is just basically, on the one hand, just encourage it to continue, but on the other hand, just basically, we haven't won yet. This is very much still active there. So we got to just keep on hitting the pavement on this. But, it really does seem to become a galvanizing issue, whether it's obviously DeSantis in Florida, whether it's any number of kind of 2024 prospective presidential candidates. Everyone seems to be kind of gravitating towards a pretty hardline anti-CRT stance on the right. And it's a good unifying issue for the right. And we need to just keep it up, honestly.
So the grassroots uprising is a function of what I think is increasingly the most important, but probably also the most subtle divide in American politics. And I'm going to read something that Josh Hawley said on the floor of the Senate on Tuesday. He said, Biden's nominees, quote, do not share a view of America as a good and decent place, who do not believe that the history of the nation is worth celebrating. And that is, I think, a very key articulation of the mentality that critical race theory in its essence is trying to instill in the next generation of Americans, and actually in, Generation X, in boomers, the people who are buying Ibram X. Kendi's book to the point, and Robin DiAngelo, to the point where it was a bestseller last summer. This is not just about the youth. This is about the country more largely. And so I think the fact that you have seen an apolitical swell of grassroots opposition to critical race theory, it really is stemming from this divide over whether America is, striving towards perfection or if it's entirely irredeemable. And that is incredibly important. And I think, increasingly, I have come to realize that, and this actually is something I started to think about a lot since I sort of went viral for debating whether America has been a net benefit on the world stage, which the answer is obviously yes, with Ryan Grimm on Rising. And I, through that experience, was exposed to exactly how widespread this sort of very militant anti-Americanism is on the left. And I don't see how you can really have a political realignment, how you can bridge that gap when the left is increasingly not accepting the premise of America. That's not even American exceptionalism, but just American goodness. And if you can't sort of muster agreement with that, where do we go? And so I think the backlash to critical race theory has shown, especially on a local level, that there is an apolitical love of country that is feeling increasingly alienated in its own country. And so it's heartening, absolutely, to see that. I think it's so important, especially to see it just among parents who might not even be very political, let alone like conservatives or Trump supporters, but to just see it from, parents across the political spectrum, I think speaks to how deeply rooted a very reasonable sense of patriotism is, but also to how attacked people who share that basic premise of America feel in the country right now. So I think this is tapping into something really deep and really important. And to the extent that we can be optimistic about it, I do think the swell of grassroots opposition has reflected something very positive.
Yeah, I agree with what Emily just said. I think it's a key distinguishing feature from a lot of the quote unquote culture war issues that we see that are sort of, divided into specific regions or focused around specific issues at like a very sort of federal national level. This definitely was something that I think taps into something very specific at a visceral local level, because these are school boards, right? And no one's training the parents that get up and speak there. They're doing it out of a sense of something deeply wrong with what their children are being taught. And I think that's a very fundamental participatory self-government sort of representative democracy way, that Americans interact with each other. But I think something else is going on here that I think concerns me greatly. And it's something Emily referred to, which is this divide about this belief in America. And I think you can hold all kinds of beliefs about your country, obviously, but when you fundamentally disagree about the premise for why the country exists or how it should continue to thrive in the way it should exist in the world in relation to other countries, that threatens America existentially, I think, a little bit, because we are a country that's built on a centralized notion of those ideas, right? It's not a country that is held together by, a shared ethnic history or like, a shared history that goes back thousands of years. We're a country built around this, very specific notion of what freedom and liberty mean, in this one geographic area. And so how this continues to play out, I think, is going to really define our politics. But again, I do think that's why, the reaction we're seeing to CRT is important, because I do think it's important for people, especially when they're in those local communities, to step up and say, stand up for their principles. And that's what they're doing. And that, I think, is inspiring. So with that, I'll move around to my topic, which is somewhat related in the sense of, so much of what we see, I think, with CRT is this like difference of reality, right? I think Josh touched on it a little bit when he's like, oh no, people want to teach about slavery and they're not being allowed. No, that's like not what CRT is. Like the two different versions of reality. And sometimes I think with the transgender sports issue, that issue is at play here. So the issue I want to talk about is the fact that there's going to be a transgender athlete in the Olympics. So a weightlifter has qualified from the country of New Zealand. This Laurel Hubbard transitioned in 2013 and is eligible to compete in the Olympics because the International Olympic Committee says if you've been on hormone therapy for 12 months and your testosterone level is like below a certain amount, you can compete in the Olympics. And so Hubbard will as a weightlifter. And it was interesting when Reuters covered this, they did cover some of the response to it. And I think it's worth quoting some of it here. There was a Belgian weightlifter, Anna van Bellingen, said basically it was, quote, like a bad joke that Hubbard was going to be allowed to compete. She said, quote, when I was told to drop the category because Laurel was obviously going to be their number one super, it was heartbreaking, like super soul destroying. And there's a number of quotes in here about, biological women who aren't going to achieve, what they thought they were going to because of the presence of this transgender athlete. And so I guess I'm just wondering with this issue, it's something this is a reality that we've talked about before. Like what is actually going to happen when biological women are shut out of the sport that they've trained, at Olympic levels to achieve. And I often wonder on this issue in particular, there's almost like this Soviet consensus that we come to that's like, I know this is a lie and you know this is a lie, but we're going to agree that this is a lie and we're going to perpetuate a reality around this obvious lie. And so I'm wondering if this is like the moment that it actually tumbles, right? That the lie crumbles and we now sort of see this for what it is. So I don't know, maybe I'm just being optimistic.
I'm generally of the belief, go ahead, Josh.
No, you go right ahead, Emily.
Well, I was gonna say, I'm generally of the belief that this lie actually will crumble at some point because on its face, it is so ridiculous. And the media sort of take on it is so out of touch with the rest of the country. And it is true that they've been able to bulldoze culture from their perches in these positions of power where they do have outsized influence despite not representing the country that they purport to cover. So while they have been able to bulldoze, I do think the more that these stories get litigated in the public square, to the extent that we're still able to actually talk about them, For me, it's a question of how quickly can we have this debate before those spaces close, right? Like if this debate can be had, as openly as possible and won, well, then maybe we've just pushed those boundaries back out a little bit. And it's sort of killing two birds with one stone, winning the argument and then winning the argument in favor of arguments. But so it's sort of a race against the clock to some extent. How quickly can we litigate this in the public square before the public square totally closes to free expression? But at the same time, I do think that cases like this, while we can still have these conversations to the extent that we can, they will crumble. The more that we actually have to litigate the science in the public square, the worse off it is for the left. The more you're going to have parents, in a blue state like Connecticut saying, listen, this is not fair. We all know it. We voted for Hillary Clinton, but we're coming out and saying this is ridiculous and we want our daughters to have a fair chance. So that said, I think, I'm actually pretty optimistic on this issue. Like J.K. Rowling, a super progressive feminist, a great example of how the dam broke. And I think that's going to continue to happen. But to some extent, it does feel like a race against the clock.
Well, if I have my nomenclature correct, I think J.K. Rowling is a TERF, right? TERF. She's a trans exclusionary radical feminist. If I have my terminology correct?
Absolutely. Yes. You're also a TERF, Josh.
I am a TERF. Okay. Well, I will take that with much pride. No, I published an op-ed in Newsweek back in like February and March from Rabbi Yaakov Menken, who's a very politically conservative Orthodox rabbi. He co-wrote this with like a hardcore left-wing feminist. They were like co-writing against the Equality Act. So these people definitely do exist. Look, I am optimistic on this issue in the long term. I don't know that this will be kind of the breakthrough moment. I'm not sure this is going to be the crossing of the Rubicon, so to speak. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but like, wasn't there like an MMA, like a mixed martial arts fight where like, a transgender biological man was competing against a biological woman and like the woman's just like skull was like bashed in and like was like severely hospitalized. I don't want to get my facts wrong here, but something like that has already happened. And that's only going to continue to happen like the more and more this continues, obviously. So look, I am hopeful on this on the long term. Just a quick kind of ancillary tangential point to make here. I did a debate on this issue at Newsweek. We do these debates of the week. I did a written debate. It was we ultimately ran in late September between Abigail Schreier, a friend of the podcast, who's very outspoken on this issue. And I must have tried for 2 months, maybe even 2.5 months to find poor Abigail a debating partner. I must have went down the list of the top 10 to 15 liberal kind of, think tank organizations. No one wanted to touch us with a 10-foot pole. And, Abigail is a Substack now that I try to keep up with. And she talks all the time about, how like these public libraries are just trying to like ban her books. And it's obviously very similar to what Amazon did with Ryan Anderson's book when Hallie met, whatever that transgender book was called, Hallie's transgender moment. And the left they are so defensive on this issue. And I think that they are defensive on this issue for a very simple reason. It is not the reason that they tell you. They would tell you that they're defensive because, the questioning of anyone's right to quote unquote affirm his or her gender is tantamount to bigotry and transphobia. I mean, that's what they tell you is the reason that they're so passionate and defensive about this. That's not the real reason. The reason is that they know that their argument is fundamentally BS. That they know that their argument is contrary to basic human chromosomal structure, is contrary to basic rudimentary principles of reason, of observational reality. Everyone can look at a situation such as this and just intuit. A toddler can look at the situation and intuit that this is wrong, that this is just wrong, that it violates kind of the natural ordering of the world. And to be clear, I am not diminishing gender dysphoria or anything of that nature. That has been the DSM for decades. That is a very kind of longstanding, legitimate psychological malady. What I am casting aspersions upon is a notion that you can just, quote unquote, affirm your gender contrary to biological reality and then just root out and crush the competition in the Olympics. So I we'll see if this is kind of a wake up moment. I hope it is. But I don't know. In the long run, I do think that we're going to be successful on this issue. But again, similar to the last minute on CRT, can't be complacent. Got to keep up the fight.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Josh. And you anticipated my comment, which was going to be everyone ought to read Abigail Schreier's latest Substack through Barry Weiss's publication, since we're going to name drop now in the last two segments, on basically that the books are burning right now. And Schreier talks about a public library where there's a huge waiting list for her book, and there's something akin to a trigger warning put in the front of the book, which says, essentially, here are other resources that you can go to find a competing view to Schreier's view, because after all, public libraries do that in every single book on any subject of consequence. And I think that actually gets to the deeper point, which is that it's very clear that this is anti-science from the people who say trust the science, and the people who do scream trust the science are really, what they're saying is, submit to our politics and don't ask any questions. But more importantly, the backlash is ultimately about wanting total control over the public square, over what ideas are acceptable and what ideas are not acceptable. And so the transgender issue is used as a wedge for the broader issue, which is controlling all dissent, controlling what narratives are allowed to proliferate and what are not, and casting anyone who dares to challenge the left's favored narratives as bigoted, of course, back to that progressive or bigot binary. So I agree, these overt issues where everyone knows in their heart of hearts that there is no science to justify this sort of, this athlete competing in a game, or there is no justification for indoctrinating kids in anti-American ideology with taxpayer dollars in schools from the time they're 5 years old or even younger. These are all issues that ultimately, when the left is open and honest about what they believe, people reject the left. All that said, at the same time, when it comes up to elite suburbanites being presented with these issues, it still seems that politically they fail, because if you look at how the last several election cycles went, mean tweets were a lot perceived, I guess, as a lot worse for parents than these sorts of radical ideas being imbued in all of our institutions. So another issue where it's very clear that obviously logic and reason are on our side, and most people at a core level understand this is insanity, notwithstanding what Josh said about gender dysphoria being a legitimate psychological issue. But all that said, politically, it still doesn't seem to necessarily move the needle. Maybe at the margins it will, and we'll see in 2022. But I guess we have to stand by and we have to continue hammering home points with soberly and with logic and emotion and reason, and to combat the hysterical left.
Well, on that point, speaking of the hysterical left and of its, I guess, influence on trends that relate to sex and gender in this country, we want to talk about an article in which the New York Times highlighted a very, very important trend that finds women delaying motherhood now across all socioeconomic cohorts. That is, the birth rate has declined the most in cities or areas where the economic growth or the job growth is higher. In economically stagnated areas, the birth rate tends to be higher. This raises a lot of very interesting questions. The sort of obvious response is that careerism, the careerism that has been pushed on women since at least the sexual revolution, has caused them to delay motherhood, and the delaying of motherhood might cause them to have fewer children than they would like. That's the case that we see so often, is that it's not just that women are having fewer children, it's that they're having fewer children than they would like to have. But then on the other hand, there's something very interesting about seeing the way in which economic opportunity is affecting the birth rate in communities where that opportunity varies. So the New York Times has a line in this piece that women, where the economy tends to be stagnated, have more children because they find purpose and fulfillment in motherhood as opposed to in work. There's a lot going on here. On the one hand, you have a generation of women that are still digging out of two recessions, right? The 2008 Great Recession, and then the economy of the pandemic, which did really hurt a lot of people in this country, even as the market kept ticking upwards. So you do have that dynamic. But one thing that we tend not to talk about often is men. They are a really critical part of this equation. And for a lot of men, average income has declined since like the late 60s. If you entered the workforce in the 80s, on average, you're earning less than somebody who entered the workforce in the 60s. That is a key element of all of this as well. I say this, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. My first really big internship was working with Christina Hoff Sommers on a re-release of The War Against Boys in 2012-ish. And as I was reading through this book and helping with some of the research and checking some of the studies, maybe how they had changed over the course of the last 15 years, how the data had changed, it is amazing how prescient that book was when it was first released in, I think, 1999 or 2000. And I think men are such a key part of this equation when it comes to the declining birth rate. So we might just look to the economy as an explanation. When job growth is high, women are finding purpose in their careers and they're trying to dig out of this hole when it comes to, finally buying a house, paying off their college debt, and you can go on down the line. But also that maybe there are fewer marriageable men, and maybe women's standards about what constitutes a marriageable man are out of whack with the reality of the supply. That's a really important question, I think, to dig into. But let me throw it open to the group here. What do you make of these numbers, that the birth rate tends to be lower in areas where job growth is highest, and that the birth rate tends to be higher where the economy tends to be stagnated?
So I think you're right to there's so much going on, right? And I there's so many threads that I think you could pull out of this. And I hesitate to latch on to any one because I don't want to feel like I'm excluding the others, but I constantly come back to something we talked about a couple of months ago. I think with Rebecca Heinrich's piece that she wrote in American Mind about this issue of women delaying childbirth. And one of the things she said struck me so much, and I'm an elder millennial, right? So I think I probably fall in the cohort she's talking about, but it's, as she was counseling students, young women about, when to have children, because Rebecca, obviously accomplished professional, I think she has 5 kids. And so, they come to her and say, how do you balance it all? And she said, don't, you have a family and then you have a career as it makes sense for you and your family beyond that. And her students are like, thank you for telling me that. No one has ever told me that. And that, I think, resonates so much with the generation that I was raised in, that really is that pushing, career first, get established, make your money, then you have a family. And no one told them, right? No one says, children and family are so much of a priority in addition to, right? And it's not this notion that you can have it all. It's just making a choice, having a priority that is family. And that has been so de-emphasized, I think, in the modern culture. So it doesn't surprise me at all, I guess, that initial sort of high level breakdown between, birth rates being lower and sort of urban, career driven cities and vice versa. But to your point about, there's a huge cultural as well as a partly material aspect to this debate too. I think my generation, again, elder millennial, got kicked in the teeth, right? We graduated right into the recession and then we got hit again. So I think the lack of marriageable men is a totally separate question. I'll leave that for the men. How about they can discuss that? And then, but I do think that there are material consequences as well.
Guys, why are you so terrible?
I'm trying to do my part here. You can go ahead, Josh.
Okay.
2 kids and a wife. I'm covered.
Yeah. As the one who's not yet married, I guess I do have more to answer for here. So look, we talked about this a little bit. I think it was back in February or March. American Compass did its family symposium, and Helen Andrews had a really nice essay for that symposium talking a little bit about kind of the lack of marriageable men. Look, I mean, on the American University campus today, certainly in many graduate schools, definitely in most law schools, but I also in most colleges, at least kind of most non-STEM engineering centric undergraduate institutions, more women than men enroll. That's kind of just the way it is. It's the way it's been for a while now, actually, for, at least probably 15, 20 years to my knowledge, possibly even a little further back than that. I could be wrong. I'm trying to kind of remember the data here in real time, but I think women also have kind of like a slightly higher graduation rate relative to men of those who matriculate. So just all else equal, more women are getting kind of robust, highly educated, higher paying jobs. So you take that reality that's currently transpiring in the academy, and you couple it with everything that's happened on trade, China, and industrial policy over the past 20, 30 years, all these kind of blue collar jobs that we have quite literally lost. It's kind of, it's kind of like the famous kind of Ross Perot line about like the swishing sound, like the vacuum to Mexico back in NAFTA in the 90s. And, we're not here to litigate NAFTA, but certainly like that has very clearly happened with respect to China since their ascension to the WTO. It's only greatly exacerbated over the past 15, 20 years or so here. So look, as far as kind of like prospective kind of policy implications of this, higher ed reform is a really, really, really big deal. It's not the first time we've discussed it, but we have to kind of get in there in the weeds and make this happen here. And, a lot of our friends kind of like, Arthur Millick of Claremont Institute talk about just, bulldozing higher education. And I agree, that definitely is part of it, but we really do need to get in there. And Tom Cotton has recent legislation kind of getting at this, of directly taxing the effective crap out of the endowments of these elite universities and directly taking that to subsidize trade and vocational skills for a lot of these kind of Rust Belt industrial towns that have just been totally, harmed by quote unquote free trade with China over the past 15, 20 years, for example. So I'm not trying to get to like panaceas here. These are deep, decades long cultural issues. We're not going to arrive at an easy conclusion here, but those are just some nibblings on the margins that might get you closer to a greater supply and demand balance vis-a-vis marriageable men.
Yeah, the falling out from the workforce of prime working age males is definitely attributable in part to what Josh said, the globalization efforts, and particularly China trade relations, and particularly in the industrial area. And a knock-on effect, of course, or sort of a double whammy there, is then the flooding in of fentanyl and opioids broadly to this population, which has led to a huge addiction epidemic, which also contributes to lack of fathers, lack of husbands, and consequently lack of stable families. Also, if you were to look at there are obviously myriad factors at play here beyond the education system, beyond the cultural pressure to put your career first, beyond what we're talking about with trade and drugs. There's also welfare policies that subsidize and in effect reward out of wedlock childbirth. So you can point to that as well. And a whole host of other factors that we can run through and should run through. I think a bigger overarching question that we ought to grapple with, and we won't be able to answer it here, is why is it that more affluent nations more broadly tend to see declining birth rates, or at least have over the last 50 years broadly? And that's a generalization, but that is really where we are. Is that because as we get more prosperous, then we get less spiritual and more material? I mean, these are much deeper fundamental questions, but it's also a question of, is it healthy if our societies are very prosperous, but they're not reproducing people? With the whole point of human existence, or in large part, a point of human existence, to perpetuate the human race. If we are affluent, but spiritually poor, which I think may be reflected in the declining birth rates and not being below replacement rate in the Western world, then we have to ask, are we really being successful? Are we really pursuing happiness as a nation and as a Western world more broadly? It's something worth exploring probably over time in future episodes.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And there was some research for a while, I haven't seen it updated, that showed the more freedom women had, the more traditionalistic paths they chose for themselves in terms of the workforce. And so we'll have to see, like if you look at Scandinavia and America, women were choosing part-time work at higher rates than in other countries. So interesting stuff. But on that note, I'm going to toss to you, Josh.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So yeah, I mean, we're talking on a bunch of like culture war-esque issues here. So the Supreme Court has recently weighed in on some culture war-esque issues, some non-culture war-esque issues here. Timing is late June. This is kind of prime time for Supreme Court opinions to come out. Sometimes it kind of dips into very early July. Honestly, this term doesn't have as many kind of flashy, high-profile cases as next term is likely to have. Already on the docket for next term, there's obviously that massive abortion case out of Mississippi. There's a big Second Amendment case. First time the court's agreeing to hear a Second Amendment case since the landmark McDonald case in 2010. So it will have been 12 years by the time they decide that next term. And while they haven't done so yet, they're probably going to grant cert and agree to hear the Harvard affirmative action case. So it's looking like we're probably going to have abortion, guns, and race on the docket next term. So lucky for my friends who are clerking at the court next term. That's a lot of fun to deal with. But for this term, it's a little more sober. It's not quite as flashy, but just kind of three quick cases that over the last week or so that I thought I would flag. The first was a 7-2 ruling in the latest Obamacare challenge. This was a challenge that originated, it was kind of if I recall, it's kind of a joint venture of sorts between the Texas and Wisconsin Solicitors General Office. They basically argued that because in 2017, Congress set the penalty, the tax, whatever you want to call it, for the individual mandate in Obamacare at zero. By definition, if it's $0, it is not a tax. Go back to NFIB v. Sebelius, the Obamacare case, where Chief Justice Roberts rewrote the statute to uphold it under Congress's taxing power. They basically said that under these facts is no longer attacked, is no longer constitutional. That argument failed by a count of 7-2. They didn't actually get into the constitutional merits. They basically kicked it out on what lawyers call standing grounds, which basically means that there was not a concrete injury that the plaintiffs could show that was traceable to the injury in such a way that the courts could remediate the issue. Not to sound overly lawyerly here. Clarence Thomas himself, kind of the most conservative justice on the court, wrote a concurrence agreeing with it. He's kind of a stickler on Article 3 standing types of rules. So the upshot here, though, is that, from a policy metric, it's obviously a letdown. Justice Alito, for what it's worth, writes kind of a scathing dissent joined by Justice Gorsuch. But, if you go back, the left was kind of fear-mongering all about Amy Coney Barrett during this, about Obamacare. If you vote for Barrett, they can strike down Obamacare. None of that materialized. Okay, quickly moving on to the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case. This was supposed to be a major religious liberty case. The city of Philadelphia effectively was threatening to not allow Catholic social services to participate in kind of its foster care program unless they agreed to violate the tenets of the Catholic Church and agreed to kind of, or at least espouse a willingness to place children in the homes of same-sex married couples. By a 9-0 decision, the court says that Philadelphia is discriminating against Catholic social services. So on paper, it's a win. In theory, it's really not a win because it was done on the most narrow Chief Justice Roberts-esque grounds possible, and they refused to touch a very problematic precedent called Employment Division versus Smith, a 1990 decision by which the court basically said that if you have a neutral law of general applicability, you're basically allowed to do that even if it has the incidental effect of burdening religion. Now, Justice Alito very clearly explains in his 77-page concurrence in this, this would open up all sorts of can of worms. You would have kind of laws like you kind of have in Europe that would effectively outlaw the banning of kosher slaughter, circumcision, things of that nature. You could issue a ban on wine by which, Catholic mass would effectively be outlawed. So there's all sorts of problematic implications here. So not much of a huge win there either. And the final case, just to quickly flag here, because it's really interesting, honestly. It came out just this week. It's kind of the antitrust case against the NCAA. Again, a unanimous court 9-0 does say that the NCAA is effectively not exempt from the antitrust laws, that they are subject to that, and that they were a monopsony, not monopoly, but a monopsony. So they were the only buyer of college athletic wages, and therefore they could not basically outlaw education-related benefits. Lots of implications there. Maybe Rachel can touch on it vis-a-vis kind of this currently unfolding antitrust dispute in the context of big tech. So I not really much of a note to end on per se, just kind of throwing out open to the panel for any comments on any of those cases, more letdowns from the quote unquote conservative court, anything of that nature.
So the antitrust case was my favorite. Obviously, no one is surprised by that. But what I really loved about it was the Kavanaugh concurrence, in which he basically didn't at all buy what is now almost a traditional argument or antitrust argument brought by business to the court, which is, no, there's nothing to see here. Look at this fancy, econometric modeling we've done that basically says, price fixing in the labor market isn't price fixing. We pay the athletes terribly because it's central to our product definition. Look at our product definition. Isn't it pretty? And Kavanaugh was like, no, you can't actually launder price fixing through, product definition. He just completely eviscerated the argument, which I found actually rather encouraging because, as I've said, I think on this show before, the state of American antitrust in my mind has been vastly distorted away from the business of law enforcement and towards sort of this speculative economics. So I was sort of encouraged to see that. And I actually do think Kavanaugh opened the door for more cases to be brought on the compensation issue with NCAA. But I think that was a great summary you gave. And I will, the last thing I'll say about it, as is my want, I suppose, when I talk about the Supreme Court, is that the fact that we have all of these cultural issues in front of the court is a failure of our self-government. It's a failure of our legislative branch to actually decide these questions in a democratic, representative way. So That's my
I
bill.
understand very little of what either of you just said, but I will jump in to say that I agree completely with Rachel on the last point, and that from my perspective, at this sort of 30,000 foot vantage point is what's remarkable, and that how we've had to kick the can from the legislative branch and of course to the executive branch as well, but to the judicial branch on so many of these charged cultural issues that could be, I suppose, obviously rectified. I mean, actually, let's take the example of Masterpiece Cake Shop. In a tight-knit community, the occurrence of something like that, if community ties and the social fabric would be strong, that's not a case that ever makes its way to the Supreme Court. I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but it's just to look at a case like that and to see how it has divided the country on a national level, it's remarkable because what you have is essentially radical instigator trying to take down a local business in these sort of very political ways time and again. And that just wouldn't happen if we had a culture where our social fabric wasn't so tattered and worn. But it is remarkable to sort of see these dynamics play out on the Supreme Court level after we've kicked the can on local, state, and federal legislative levels. So with that, I'll defer.
Yeah, I 1000 a point agree. The big picture point is that we wouldn't have to worry about a Roberts court that's a conservative court in name only, in large part, if every issue of substance was not punted to the administrative state or the courts itself, which is a dereliction of duty of the legislative branch, which is supposed to be responsive to us, and instead engages in kabuki theater, essentially, while unelected bureaucrats and judges really run the country at the end of the day and make law. Narrow issue, which I think is significant with respect to the court itself, is that it does appear that Alito has had enough, and to some extent Gorsuch has had enough too, with the sort of Robertsian, narrowly tailored decisions when they're effectively in favor of what the conservative position is, and then oftentimes siding with the other side in large measure. There were some amazing lines written in both opinions from Alito and Gorsuch. Alito said of that Philadelphia Catholic charity case, "This decision might as well be written on the dissolving papers sold in magic shops." That's a direct quote. And Gorsuch said, "Perhaps our colleagues believe today's circuitous path would at least steer the court around the controversial subject matter and avoid picking a side. Dodging the question today guarantees will recur tomorrow. These cases will keep coming until the court musters the fortitude to supply an answer. Respectfully, it should have done so today." That's pretty much the epigraph of the Roberts court right there. It's shameful, but it should inspire us to do everything that we can to ensure that these questions are litigated by our legislators, not by unelected judges for life.
Well, with that, maybe Josh, you have anything you want to say before we go around the room?
No, I was just going to wrap a bow on it and say that I think Ben is very accurate to phrase that as kind of the epigraph of the Roberts court. I mean, this has become John Roberts' signature kind of, it's his modus operandi at this point. I mean, like if you kind of look at the earlier John Roberts era, he had some harsh language about affirmative action policies. There were some other issues, the Second Amendment issues, of course, where he was more conservative. But for whatever, bona fides he may or may not have had in his earlier tenure, I literally, my best guess, honestly, is that John Roberts basically just got like Jen Rubinized during the Trump administration. That's actually what I think basically happened here. And if he's not David Souter, he's very closely getting to that point. It wouldn't surprise me if he truly becomes full Souter within the next term or two, honestly.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. But with that, I think we'll go around the room. Ben, you want to start?
Sure. So just briefly, in the same line of thinking with kind of Roberts caring about preserving the institution, and supposed independence of the institution, I would argue over the Constitution. In last week's show, I talked at length about the Biden administration's countering domestic terrorism strategy, so-called. And towards the end of that strategy, it talks about a deeper effort that must be made to restore integrity, restore faith in government, as if government has done anything to engender our faith. And I think it points to a similar establishmentarian ruling class view that really what matters is protecting their bureaucracies. It's not actually using those bureaucracies towards the ends that we created those bureaucracies to achieve in the first place. Let us hope, I guess, to try to bring things full circle, that issues like CRT and transgenderism and beyond puncture and further erode confidence, faith, and trust in institutions that have done nothing to deserve it, and that we replace this ruling class, not with a ruling class, but with a class of people who actually represent the country that has been so good to them. Let's hope for that.
I'll jump in right after Ben, just to say, probably in a kind of awkward transition, that I just filed a story on the Kardashians, and it reminds me of the CRT debate and again, maybe an awkward way, but there's something very true about the fact that the Kardashians sort of suffered from the same materialistic, or the malaise of materialism that a lot of Americans do. And as the show is ending, you can also see, though, that while birth rates were declining, the Kardashians were being fruitful and multiplying and gravitating towards the sense of traditionalism, gravitating towards Christianity in interesting ways. And I do think, in a similar sense, some of what is so obvious to humans and is so enduring about the human condition, the ways that our culture is attacking some of the obvious elements of the human condition, and some just like the basic sense of logic and consensus of like biology. It seems as though it's very possible that will overcome the secularization, because there is so much that is obvious and is enduring, that we're in this sort of war right now between the two sort of different factions, right? There's sort of, and in the same people, to some extent. And you're seeing this play out on the right in a conversation that this podcast contributes a lot to: common good conservatism, right? Which is a pushback on the sort of very raw materialism of free market fundamentalism. And so I think this is what's the forces that are really at war, not just in America, but worldwide, and why we have seen sort of populist movements in other countries. And I think, as we're sort of ruminating on all of this stuff, it does seem entirely possible that one side, because it is enduring and it is so very human, will triumph at the end of the day.
Yeah, but my final thought is honestly a direct play off of what Emily was just talking about here, which is just, and it's something that we haven't already talked about, but it's worth emphasizing just how catastrophically wrong for a long time the Republican Party and its K Street consultant class was about the way that the party ought to go moving forward here. We've mentioned the infamous kind of post-Romney-Ryan's previous commission GOP autopsy after the 2012 election numerous times before, where the party infamously said, soften up the rhetoric, the language, the policies on immigration-related issues, definitely don't go all the way on these, LGBT, true kind of quote unquote cultural related issues. But if there's anything that we've seen over the past few months, over the past really kind of year, 2, even 3 years, and, it's kind of the running theme of this entire podcast episode, what we've seen is that the quote unquote culture war issues are exactly how you build a winning coalition. To the contrary, talking about kind of nerdy, abstruse obsessions like capital gains, tax cuts, at the worst, or even like quote unquote occupational licensing reform at the best, which by the way can be an important policy, but like holding that and viewing it in juxtaposition to, white kids in kindergarten getting told that they are born oppressors, that like, women's sports, the very definition of what it means to be a woman, frankly. And here's Emily, here's like my turf, here's my trans exclusionary radical feminist side of really coming out here on these final shots. The very, I'm trying hard not to laugh here. I'm sounding like J.K. Rowling, but like, it's true. Like femininity and like womanhood itself is like basically on the ballot box at this point here. I don't think that's overstating the point. That is quite literally what is happening here. These are the issues by which to build a winning political coalition. These are the grassroots. These are kind of the groundswell by which to kind of build a movement. Not these kind of like dorky, frankly, economic and administrative issues. That's not to say that economic policy isn't important. It is, but it cannot and should not be the bread and butter of a winning conservative coalition.
Well, that's kind of what I think is actually encouraging about the moment, or the reaction anyway, that we're seeing to critical race theory, because this is not something that was led by the institutional political class. If you remember a couple episodes back when I talked about a panel conversation with Chris Rufo, where he said, I tried actually to get the political institutional Republican Party involved, and they were like, we don't do this. And so he's like, I'll just go do it myself. And that I find encouraging, because if the party's not going to do it, the people will do it themselves. And they will not defer, I think, to this sort of out of touch political class. And I do think it's encouraging, because at some point the pendulum has swung so far that it will swing back. And now I think we have to be concerned with what happens in the interim. And I think that's what we are all concerned with. And to be honest, it's why I focus so much on the big tech debate, because I think Emily made a great point of like, this is different than the silent majority of the 70s, because the forums in which we debate this are under threat. And when you cannot speak and you cannot be heard, that changes the nature of the debate itself. But the debate is being had. And I think in a very robust, very organic, very heartfelt way. And I do find that encouraging. This is not some AstroTurf grass tops, movement. It really is something I think that's organically felt. And I think you're going to start to see that more and more when people's traditional values and their very American way of life. And by that, I mean just being able to speak about what they believe in and, refer to America's history without being called racist. Like that is very fundamental. And I think when that's under threat, you'll see people start to step up and respond. So that's my white pill for the end of the episode. So I'm Rachel Bovard on behalf of Ben, Josh, and Emily. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next NatCon Squad.